I want to talk about the Avengers, Trump's so-called Avengers. Tulsi Gabbard, why is she controversial as a pick for Director of National Intelligence?
Well, one thing to keep in mind for not just Tulsi, but a number of these picks is that...
So why is Kash Patel then so controversial?
So the line of attack for Kash Patel is going to be, that is something that has them completely freaked out.
J.D. Vance, Vice President. How does he fit into this?
Vance, I think, is critical.
Can I ask about Vivek Ramaswamy?
That comes from the bureaucrats, and that's the real danger that we have in America, I think, is that the thing that I think is definitely going to happen is the bureaucracy fires back. They always fire back. And the way that they fire back is that they...
How much can they actually go in there and change things up?
Let me just make one particular point about this.
Before you hear from Ben Domenech, I ask if you want to support this show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Ben exploring the issues that you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Ben Domenech. Ben Domenech, thank you for having me in your home here in Alexandria. I want to talk about the Avengers, Trump's so-called Avengers. I notice on your fridge behind me, there is a Christmas card from Tulsi Gabbard, a family friend, who is set to replace Jake Sullivan as Director of National Intelligence. And that's probably one of the most controversial, or I say that Pete Hegseth to a Democrat seemed very controversial. He seemed to stir them all up the wrong way. But Tulsi Gabbard, I kind of wanted to get into the best case for her, the best case against her. What should people understand? Why is she controversial as a pick for Director of National Intelligence?
Well, one thing to keep in mind for not just Tulsi, but a number of these picks is that they were Democrats until just a few seconds ago in terms of our politics, RFK included in that, but a number
Musk.
of other selections as well, very short political history in terms of being on the right. And because of that, they have opinions that tend to inflame the attitudes of both Republicans on Capitol Hill and Democrats as well. Democrats who feel betrayed, perhaps. Tulsi was one of the vice chairs of the Democratic Party who left that role in 2016 when she felt like Bernie Sanders was getting an unfair shake when he was running against Hillary Clinton. And she was very much viewed as being in this anti-war faction of the Democratic coalition, though she was also someone who was viewed as very pro-military, her own military background being a part of that. Republicans are skeptical of her, though, because there is a huge portion of the Republican elected officials on Capitol Hill who hold traditionally hawkish views when it comes to our foreign policy that are at odds with Tulsi. And there are also a number of them who, despite the fact that they may talk about problems they have with the FBI or their belief that that place needs to be reformed. By the way, I do actually think Kash Patel is probably going to end up being the most controversial of these selections. But Tulsi is someone who's very much on the outside of that group because they still believe in investing enormous power in our intel services as it relates to foreign policy. They may have issues about domestic stuff, but they still are pro-CIA or what have you. This, by the way, played out recently with the replacement of Mike Turner, the longtime defender of the intel community, as the intel chair, a big move by Speaker Johnson that was reportedly motivated by Donald Trump basically feeling that Turner was too close to the intelligence community that he believes needs to be reformed. So naming Tulsi to the office of the Director of National Intelligence is clearly a sign that she's going to be in a reform-minded role as being someone, as opposed to being someone who was just comfortable with everything that the intel community says. One thing that was experienced during the first Trump administration, for instance, was tension between the intel community and what various figures around Trump would disclose publicly. They would basically say, oh, you shouldn't go on TV and say this thing or something along those lines. When it came to, a number of the different officials who occupied intel roles under Trump, particularly John Ratcliffe, who, of course, is now set to be the next head of the CIA. So it's one of these things that you have this tension that exists between various, figures who are at odds on certain portions of the empowerment of the intel community, particularly the FISA courts, which obviously were key to the entire Russiagate play out, and the renewal of the Section 702 of basically this domestic spying section.
Can you just those two things, FISA
Sure.
courts and Section 702?
So the way that
just unpack them.
So the way that just the simplest way that I can say this in short terms is the FISA court exists because you need to have some kind of entity approving secret warrants that would basically allow the internal domestic spying that a lot of our intel services believe that they need to do in order to look at people who they think are working for foreign entities or who are compromised, etc. These are secret courts that approve these warrants secretly. The problem is that, as we've learned, it was something that people like Rand Paul were raising, years before the Trump experience. But as we've learned through the Trump experience, as a lot more Americans have learned, these courts essentially act as rubber stamps. They're handed something, they don't really have the ability to judge whether it's accurate or not, and then they just rubber stamp it, and suddenly, before you know it, the intel communities are spying on all these people who are associated with Donald Trump.
Yeah, so the big controversy was
Yes.
Obamagate, Russiagate.
Yeah, exactly.
Obama spying on Trump's campaign in 2016.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And using that as the justification for much broader phishing expeditions into those people, which of course were designed to bring down Trump. And because of that, he wants all these things to be reformed. When it comes to her role, though, the approval process of getting into that job means you have to navigate a fairly unique committee setup. The Intel Committee on the Senate side is viewed as the power center in Washington of all of this. And it is, unlike other committees, viewed as truly a bipartisan situation. Mark Warner, who's the Democrat on that committee, is someone who commands more respect than some of his other Democrat colleagues among Republicans, and he's someone who they view as being, more of an honest broker compared to someone like Adam Schiff, on the House side, now obviously a senator from California. The thing that is going to be critical for Tulsi, though, is that it just comes down to the votes on the floor. She is very close. The question is whether she can afford to lose the number of people we think that we already see as being lost and still get through.
On the Republican side.
On the Republican side.
Okay, so
and let me just make one particular point about this. The move by Mitch McConnell to leave the leadership job, he's obviously been replaced by John Thune, but to stay in office is the wild card here. He has already indicated to the press that he is not necessarily satisfied with her selection. He has questions about her. He's obviously someone who historically has been very pro-intel community in terms of trusting them a lot more than your typical Republican on Capitol Hill. And it's possible that she could be the only nominee that he opposes. There's also additional questions for her from people like Murkowski, Todd Young from Alaska, and John Curtis, the new replacement for Mitt Romney from Utah, in a way that clearly has some work to do in terms of lobbying them and convincing them. On the flip side, she's probably going to get at least one, maybe two, maybe even three Democrat votes. You could clearly see a situation where she gets the votes of a number of Democrats who are going to be facing critical reelection cycles in the next 2 years. That includes John Ossoff from Georgia. It includes Gary Peters from Michigan. John Fetterman has already been fairly positive about her. And I think that you could actually see Bernie Sanders, where this whole thing started, maybe coming back and voting for her out of the loyalty that she had shown to him in the past. I think that's not out of the realm of possibility. And he obviously shares some of her anti-war views. But I think that this is a situation where there are a lot of paths for her to end up getting through. But which one works out? If she gets more, she could end up getting more opposition, more support from some key Democrats that puts her over even in the face of Republican opposition.
So in basic terms, is it that the Democrats are worried about her reform, and the Republicans who don't like her are worried about her attitude to foreign policy? Because she has said some controversial things. For example, did she have a meeting with Assad in 2017?
Yes, she did.
Famously, Barry Weiss called her an Assad toady on the Joe Rogan podcast. Her attitude.
I don't think she would still hold to that today.
I don't think I think she's retracted. Barry's retracted it, I'm pretty sure.
But one thing I would say about that trip She went to Lebanon with Dennis Kucinich, I think, on that trip, without knowing in advance that they were going to go and meet with Assad. Then she was already on it, and I think that she decided to go. I don't think it was designed to be anything more than a member of Congress meeting someone who they frankly wanted to see a wind down of conflict and war. I think that there's some degree of naivete that affected that, and I think that she's learned a lot from it. My view of Tulsi is pretty simple. She's even though she's a very complex and interesting person, people have to understand her through the lens of the experience during the War on Terror, her experiences, as a war fighter in that.
She was in Iraq
context.
and Kuwait.
Yes. And the situation that I think emerges from that for a lot of people, you can call it PTSD. You can just call it having kind of a dominant effect on the way that you view the world. But I think it's something that affected her, and I think it affected J.D. Vance. I think it affected a lot of people who've come back from that. I think it affected Pete Hegseth. One of the reasons that I look at Pete a little differently from, some of his critics, and I say this as someone who's known him since 2011. We're not like close friends, but we were colleagues at Fox and at the Blaze. I think he's someone who was profoundly dealt for several years after his experiences in war with a lot of the challenges that face our veterans when they come back. PTSD, stress. You see a lot of alcoholism. You see a lot of substance abuse. You see a lot of things you see a lot of wrecked marriages. You see a lot of things that the people have lived through in that generation that's now entering. I'm 43. There's a whole cohort of people who were my friends when I was in college who signed up. I changed. 9/11 changed my life. I wanted to be a National Geographic reporter. I wanted to go around and go to interesting places, live there for 3 months and write a big piece about it. Instead, I quit college and went and worked for the White House and was a speechwriter for George W. Bush and for the administration there for, a number of years, and then on Capitol Hill for John Cornyn for a number of years. And I never would have done that because I wanted to be a magazine writer. Now cut to 20 years later, and I am a magazine writer, and it's great. But I do think that there's so many people for whom that period of time changed their lives, and who the experience of war changed their lives. And I think finally with this administration, we are going to see numerous people in key positions whose lives and careers were changed by that experience. And the lessons that they took from those experiences can be different and varied. I think, Mike Waltz's lessons are going to be different than Tulsi Gabbard's lessons. But
what are the lessons?
Well, I think that some people, I think at the center of it, I think, is humility, which is to say, to look back on the Bush administration and the idea that, as Dick Cheney even said, we would be greeted as liberators, when we went into Baghdad, that was something that was false bravado, that we were trying to achieve too much. And frankly, that when the democracy agenda people took over the conversation, it really shifted things in a dramatic way. There's a piece many years ago in Commentary Magazine, written by one of the people who was a key part of that effort to reform Iraq, that I still recall. He wrote in part, about the lessons learned from that. And I'm going to paraphrase because I won't get it exactly accurate. Do all men yearn for freedom? On some level, yes. But they yearn for other things too. Some men prefer security to freedom. Some men prefer faith to freedom. Some men kiss their chains. And I think that there is a lesson in that about the differences of culture and the differences of history that needed to be learned from that experience. And that perhaps the best outcome that we could have is a place that was less of an enemy or was less of a problem for our allies in the region, where fewer people were getting their heads chopped off on a regular basis, and not something that would be, a domino effect that would establish a constitutional republic with, the George Washington of Baghdad or something like that coming in.
So what you're saying, this a sort of backlash against neoconservatism, a backlash.
Very much so.
This is Trump's always been anti-Iraq war. I do think that this general American populist movement, 2005, they spent $1 trillion on failed wars in the Middle East. All of these people were active participants on. 5 years later, of course, there's the $1 trillion Wall Street bailouts. Yeah. It seems to me that the American populist movement is animated by a movement against all. It's not just these individuals who fought and saw firsthand how disastrous it was, but the whole country is kind of turned against that.
Yes, and I think that you don't have to have someone in your family yourself in order to see the reflections of this. One of the more interesting studies that that was done by a professor, Canadian professor, I believe, who looked at the map of basically the Trump vote in 2016, found that one of the things that was a big indication of movement was not that you were sort of a member of the forgotten class yourself of white working Americans who came back from, war or military service and got hooked on fentanyl or something like that. It was that you were adjacent to it, meaning that you had someone who was in your family who was going through this experience. There weren't enough of those experiences to make the difference in terms of the voters in this. But if you had a proximity to that, higher levels of drug use, higher levels of bankruptcy, higher levels of, losing your house and your job, then the lesson you took away from that was something needs to change because of what's happening to my uncle or what's happening to my nephew, what's happening to my friend. And I think that that's something that's very true of the American experience over the last several years. And it's one that Democrats, frankly, used to be a lot more aware of. They were, much more attuned to the way that these decisions affected people. Certainly in the Vietnam era, they were, and that's something that I think that their party generally lost. And then they lost it during the Obama years, where they basically said, we have this new coalition of the up and coming urban elite and the college educated students. And, we have a coalition that looks a lot more like our donor class, frankly, like they want it to look, than, having these people who cling to their guns and their religion, which obviously Barack Obama said, not in the general. He said it in the primary when he was battling Hillary before the Pennsylvania primary. And that's one of the reasons.
He said what?
He said that he criticized voters who were still clinging to their guns and religion. Bitter clingers.
Bitter clingers. And Pelosi's still banging that drum.
So that's kind of his preface to the deplorable comment on his own side. Now, what I do think is indicative, though, of all of this is, or what I think all of these Avenger selections, as you describe them, indicate, Trump is casting a really wide net here, but the avoidance of naming people who even have the least amount of neocon association with them is very interesting. There was surprise when he announced early on that Mike Pompeo was not going to be back into the admin. Everybody knew Nikki Haley wasn't going to go back in because she was not going to be. She ran against him, obviously. But when he announced that Pompeo was not going to go back in, a lot of people sort of said, because Pompeo has a reputation for being a hawk, vaguely neoconservative in some ways. Obviously, he, is a veteran and also, was the head of the CIA and was Secretary of State for Trump in his first term. And he was viewed as a loyal soldier for Trump and someone who fought for him in the press, obviously chose not to run against him when he easily could have. And I think that that's something that made people kind of say, oh, he's going to have a higher standard for keeping anybody who is associated with like the traditional think tank swamp blob out.
But Rubio is the new pick.
So Rubio, what's interesting,
Secretary of State.
I would argue that Rubio, more than anyone else who ran in 2016 against Trump, I think Rubio learned the most from it and the toughest lessons about who to trust, about who he could count on. He was backed to such a degree by neoconservatives. He was backed by other people too. He was actually backed by a lot of social conservatives. Ted Cruz was kind of the Tea Party candidate, and that kind of thing. But I think that what Rubio has learned in the years since then has been very helpful to him, and especially when it comes to his focus on dealing with the China problem, which is obviously the central issue I view for this Secretary of State. He's got a lot of issues to deal with, but I think that that's the central one. And he also became a lot more populist when it came to his economic views. He stopped just sounding like a lockstep free trader. He became much more open to some of the areas where use of trade policy to advance the American interest is something that he's much more open to. He still has a little bit of a foot there in that side of things, and I think that's why he didn't get picked to be VP, even though he was in the final running. But I do think that having him at Sec State, if you have a guy like that who has more of a diplomatic bent to him, you have a guy in Waltz who is going to be at NSC, who's going to be I think he's going to be essentially the Western Hemisphere guy, the Mexico-focused guy, and battling cartels and things like that. And then you have Tulsi. That's pretty much the American rights foreign policy spectrum right now. They've gotten rid of the neocons effectively, or they've self-yeeted themselves into the Democratic coalition. And this is what the new right looks like, at least for now. If it has permanence, that's an open question, because Tulsi's just one person. Rand Paul is just one person. Thomas Massey's just one person. Can you turn that into something that's more of a intel skeptical restraint in terms of foreign policy, approach? I will say Tulsi didn't, applauded the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and I think that there's a whole group of Americans who are absolutely fine with reaching out on occasion to kill a really bad terrorist. But there is definitely much, especially after the Afghanistan debacle, which one could argue Joe Biden never
Biden's
recovered
Afghanistan debacle.
Yes.
To pull out, yeah.
I think that people have said we never want to see that happen again. And to have such a sour, bad taste in your mouth for all the veterans who served over there, looking back and saying, what did we get out of this? What did we get from all the loss of life and treasure and time? And I think that the answer to that is very, very little.
So actually, neoconservatism has left America sore and raw, and so that's what this movement is. So why is Kash Patel then so controversial?
I think Kash Patel is controversial because Kash Patel's very honest about what he wants to do, which is, I think he believes the FBI is shot through with partisan, corrupt people. Not all the agents, obviously, but that
who doesn't believe that?
The bureaucracy of it, the agents themselves, the hierarchy, that they abuse their power, that they have too much power automatically, and that he wants to go in there and clean house. And I will say, Kash, he had a number of different roles in the first administration, including, in his background as U.S. attorney, and his background as someone who, the key thing that he did was he wrote and drafted the Devin Nunes memo that went out about the investigation that Adam Schiff and other Democrats were conducting, because he was so infuriated by what he saw.
What investigation, sorry?
Hill staffer. So this is the main Russiagate investigation, the first that led, of course, eventually to the first impeachment. What Kash observed, he was working on the Hill for Devin Nunes at the time, who was the ranking member, was Schiff and his fellow Democrats would have these private interviews and meetings that Republicans would sit in on, that were supposed to be secret and behind the scenes. And then Schiff and all the Democrats would go out and go on air, on camera, and make all these wild claims about what had been disclosed. You will remember Schiff saying, oh yes, we absolutely have evidence that Donald Trump was compromised by Russia, just saying that repeatedly. And he was infuriated by it, and basically put out a memo that kind of went chapter and verse and said, they are selectively quoting and exaggerating these things that these witnesses are saying in order to try to create this narrative. And that's a big no-no when you're on those intel committees to just come out with something like that. But he was ultimately proven correct. And so he has a lot of enemies in this town, and it'll be interesting to me to see what happens. But he's very honest about how much he wants to go in there and smash the place up and just be.
Does he have
rolling
power
dice
to
on-
do that? Because I listen to some people talk about these. I listen to, for example, Mike Benz talk about the deep state, and Mike Benz himself was in there, and the way he describes it is like, actually, how much can they really do?
Mhm.
How much can someone even at the top come in? And this maybe applies to all of these roles that are being put for these people have been put forward to these new roles, whether it's Tulsi or
Sure.
Patel. How much can they actually go in there and change things up?
Well, it depends on whether you follow the letter of the law or whether you follow the norms, shall we say. There was a ton of controversial stuff that happened under George W. Bush's presidency, for instance, including the firing of a bunch of politically appointed U.S. attorneys that made, the Washington Post like freak out for a month. But that is something that the president can do. When it comes to the naming of one of the few people who was going back into their same position that they held in the prior administration, one of them is Russ Vought, who's over at the OMB. And one of the last things that he did in the prior administration was finally get across the finish line this executive order step that would have essentially recategorized a huge chunk of bureaucrats. I say huge, but it's really only between 60 and 80,000 out of millions, obviously, of senior bureaucrats that would be reclassified as being political appointees, meaning that the president has the power to demand their resignations and that they reapply for their jobs. For the Washington, D.C. area, where all these bureaucrats like believe that they run the town and that presidents are just occasional nuisances who show up, that is absolutely not kosher. To say, no, we actually have the power to recategorize you and fire you. That is something that has them completely freaked out. When you heard them freaking out, by the way, about Project 2025, that's the number one thing that Washington is worried about. All that other stuff that they were talking about, that is just for show.
So why are they worried about Project 2025?
So Project 2025, which is obviously the heritage blueprint for the new administration, every 4 years, Heritage comes out with a blueprint. They just happen to brand it differently this time. They branded it Project 2025. And so Democrats seized on it as being an issue that they could use. You may remember a woman in Chicago at the DNC who was holding up a giant version of it in like a mock-up book, which was pretty hilarious. The truth is that Russ Vought at OMB, who previously held different roles on Capitol Hill and the like for many years, and I've known him for many years, he did tons of work with Heritage in the past on this same point. And it's basically, it's incredibly boring stuff, but it's reform of the administrative state. It's the essentially ending permanent bureaucratic employment.
And that was written in Project 2025.
It is
As I said, a note on Project 25. Listeners, of course, will remember that Trump, throughout his campaign, was distancing himself. He even called them the radical right. I think he might have called them the extreme right.
Because he thought they were going to make him lose.
And we had Dr. Kevin Roberts, chairman of, I believe, of Heritage Foundation, the think tank behind it. And he, on the show, openly said, Trump said that, and then called me up that night. I was like, I just had to say it. Trump absolutely lied about his...
Knowing Kevin Roberts a little bit, first off, that's almost I'm sure it's 100% true because Kevin wouldn't make that up.
It's not in his interest to say that about Trump.
Also, it was just shocking from a conservative think tank perspective because think tanks typically, they put out these big things. I actually got a physical copy of it just because I want to keep it as it's this thick. Like no one actually read all of this, and they were just using it as a scary symbol. But think tanks have to beg and plead for anyone to cover anything that they do. We worked for years on this white paper that will finally solve the problems of nuclear regulation. Please read it. And it's like 10 people read it, but they're the most important 10 people.
But quite a lot of nominees are authors of...
Yeah, or they're either authors or they have overlap or they worked on it in the past. And it's just stuff that, my favorite part of it is there's a chapter on FEC reform by Hans von Spakovsky, who is a real person, a very smart guy who works at Heritage, and it's like the idea that Hans has been working on FEC reform for 25 years maybe, and then suddenly he becomes controversial. But the thing that is important to understand about this is it's about reordering who really has the power in this relationship. does the duly elected president and the executive branch that works for him, the political appointees that work for him, do they have the power to dictate policy in accordance with what Americans voted for? Or are bureaucrats basically allowed to stick their foot in the dirt and say, we're not moving for the next 4 years in the hopes that we can get a Democrat elected who will just let us run wild? Because that's exactly, by the way, what happened under Biden. Under Biden, all the things that they'd been waiting on to do under Hillary came back out again. Okay. And Biden himself was not leading any of this. It was all, his underlings basically just saying, do whatever you want. HHS, do whatever you want. Department of Education, do whatever you want. It's not like Biden was saying, we need trans, people in girl sports. We need to have boys being able to compete with girls. That's not something that came from Biden. It's just that all the bureaucrats there looked at that Title IX rule that came out of Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump and said, we hate this. We're going to get rid of this as soon as possible. And we're going to force people in public school districts across the country to do this because we think that it's important. And that comes from the bureaucrats. And that's the real danger that we have in America, I think, is that people have been in 1980, it was a change election. In 1992, it was a change election. In 2000, it was a change election, barely. In 2008, it was a big change election. And in 2016, it was a change election. And now we've had back-to-back change elections, though I would argue that the Biden one is weird because it's mostly a change about people just wanting to go back to work and, get out of this COVID authoritarian stuff. By the way, I do believe that was Trump's undoing. His last year in office, he made so many mistakes related to that, I think was, but anyway, the point is the American people have been demanding change. The reason that change hasn't happened is because these bureaucrats, they're all the same bureaucrats. They've been here since the 90s. They don't want to change. They like the way things work and they want to keep control of their fiefdom.
What you're saying actually makes sense because one of the questions I've been asking myself for probably the majority of Biden's presidency is, who exactly is running this ship? It's not him. In fact, I was listening on the way here to Speaker Johnson speaking again to Barry Weiss about how he'd just had a meeting with President Biden about LNG, I think, liquid natural gas. Biden had put some sort of new policy through 3 weeks ago. Johnson asked him about it, and Biden had no idea what he was talking about. Yeah. And so it seems to me, no one's home.
Peter Ducey, who covers the White House for Fox, and I encourage you to look this up and check it out. He just ran through kind of a bunch of things that clearly came out of him wanting to say them publicly now that he can, because there's only 2 days left in this admin, where he just talked about how they orchestrated and kept Biden away from the press. Because one of the things that would happen, especially early in the presidency, is when they could shout at him and they were close enough that he could hear them, he would come to them and talk to them, because he obviously has done that his whole career, as a politician. But what they did is that they would move them further away. They would play music so he couldn't hear them, whatever questions they were shouting. They would create scenarios whenever he was giving something he needed to present to them, where they would use the smallest room possible. They would have the podium immediately in front of whatever door he was going to enter from, and then another door directly in his line of sight, so that he would come in, give the statement, and then, have literally, like a 10-foot walk to the next door, so that they had so little time to shout a question at him. Because if we know one thing about Joe Biden throughout his entire career, is he's always been a guy who'd talked too much and would wind himself into knots and get in trouble for things that he said. And basically they just put him in this box to try to prevent the media from being able to see the thing that we all eventually saw.
Yeah.
And Chuck Schumer, there's a quote from Chuck Schumer that was reported in the Wall Street Journal recently, that he would have phone calls with Biden routinely, even much earlier in the presidency, where Biden would call him and they would have a conversation, and then Biden would admit he had forgotten why he was calling.
Wow. I mean, you describe him having easy access to get off the rostrum or whatever, but bless his cotton socks, even with the door right in front of him, seriously, the poor bastard getting lost.
I know. He would still get lost.
So Kash Patel, then, is he? The way you're talking, the picture you paint is that it's the bureaucracy versus the people.
Yeah.
And Trump is, and all these people, these Avengers he's putting it's to tear apart the bureaucracy. So I'm interested to understand then, this is the war we should be focusing on then for the next 4 years. This is the battle that's going on. How can what strengths do each side have? What's the defense the bureaucracy have for against Kash Patel?
So
what's the line of attack for Kash Patel?
So the line of attack for Kash Patel is going to be, I think he's immediate. I would not be surprised if he shows up and he has a list of names already who are going to get fired or are going to get suspended or are going to have to go through a process and that kind of thing. I'm sure that he does. That's unique for him. That's not going to be true of everybody. The thing that I think is definitely going to happen is the bureaucracy fires back. They always fire back. And the way that they fire back is that they leak, they seek to undermine you. You're going to have all of these Avengers show up, and they're going to have different advantages and disadvantages based on the place that they're going into. Many of these places, the bureaucrats have cultivated relationships with the reporters who cover them at places like Washington Post, Politico, industry publications, etc., where they're going to seek to leak and undermine these different figures in embarrassing ways, in they don't know what they're doing ways. The way the State Department, for instance, leaked heavily about Rex Tillerson was a real shock to him. I think it's one of the reasons he lasted such a short amount of time as Secretary of State, despite, literally running Exxon, so it takes somebody who has some capability. And you see that happen really across the way, with the exception of the Pentagon. The Pentagon tends to be the place that leaks less, which is one of the reasons why it took us like a week to realize that Lloyd Austin hadn't been seen because he'd taken off to get some surgery done that he hadn't told people about.
Who's he?
Lloyd Austin was the Secretary of Defense under Biden.
Okay.
So the thing that I would anticipate is that you're going to start seeing negative stories about these people immediately. As soon as they show up in their job and try to do something that bureaucrats don't like, then they're going to start firing back in all the ways they know how. They'll invent stories, but they'll also come up with things that, and this is something that they do a lot. There are all sorts of different requirements of your job that when you get into these cabinet roles, that are things that are not central to the priorities of a new administration.
Yeah.
So all the different stuff that you just have to tick off automatically and deal with. Many bureaucrats will kind of play hide the ball with that type of stuff and then use the fact that you didn't pay attention to it as an example of like an embarrassing thing that you just failed to do. And a similar, by the way, tactic to something like what we saw in the Pete Hegseth hearing when I can't remember if it was Duckworth or Hirono asked Hegseth about his opinion of the ASEAN alliance. And Pete, clearly a little bit confused, started talking about South Korea and Japan and that kind of thing. And the senator immediately jumped in and said, well, none of those are in the ASEAN alliance. You need to do more of your research, et cetera. Well, one of the reasons that Pete wouldn't know about the ASEAN alliance or have been briefed on it is because it's an economic alliance, not a military alliance. And so he actually doesn't really have, it's Malaysia, Indonesia, all of those, the Philippines, et cetera, but it's economic. And so it wouldn't have been part of his briefing package anyway.
But also in that you could see, we're talking about tactics, or
yeah,
they were trying to get him about his family affairs, his affairs, his children. They were really going ad hominem as if that was anyone's business. It's obviously not.
Well, it's not, but it's also, again, I was talking earlier about, we have a generation of people who went through something that these people didn't. There's part of this too is recency bias, in the sense that if you have something like this in your history and you've, been sort of 10 years in a different area of industry or something like that. Pete went from criticizing these senators to being in front of them in the space of 3 months, criticizing them constantly on TV, especially over the way that they've treated the American military, which is a travesty. And, having family in the military on both my wife's side and my side, the way that they speak about the things that have gone on there and how much they are surrounded by people who are depressed by the experience, and how low morale has been. you need someone like Pete who understands that, I think, to go in there and actually shake up the place. I like Pete. I think he will get confirmed. I think he's allayed a lot of the concerns of people about his own personal life and everything like that. And I think he would be good in that job. But I think that one of the big reasons, though, that you have to make a huge move like that is that we've been seeing this morale get lower and lower and lower, and recruiting getting tougher and tougher and tougher. You know, they finally had to bring back "Be All You Can Be" because none of their other slogans were working. So I think that what you're seeing here, though, is a return to the presidency for Trump in a way that indicates so much about what he learned from the first experience. He wants loyal people. He's not going to hire John Bolton types who disagree with him fundamentally, even if it gains him some respect from people who their opinion no longer matters to him. He's going to hire people who are good communicators. He's going to hire people who can stand up and make the case for themselves and for the policy that he wants them to pursue. And I think that he's going to trust that the next echelon down of people who are hired into the deputy and assistant secretary positions are going to be the people who know the policy areas, know where the bodies are buried, and show up basically with the command to really pursue the kind of bureaucratic reform that is dramatic and that he wants to see. He's splitting the job effectively. He's got communicators at the top. And then, I mean, a perfect example of this, I would say, is you look at RFK and HHS. RFK, obviously, very little experience in terms of government, experience as an attorney, et cetera, and mostly in the environmental realm. But then underneath RFK, you name Jim O'Neill to be his second in command. Jim, who was my old boss 20 years ago, is a guy who has spent his career working in health policy, he's part of Peter Thiel's longevity projects and everything related to that, helped run the foundation there, and is someone who's extremely intelligent, Ivy League pedigree, et cetera. And so when you get somebody who has worked at HHS before to go back in, who has that kind of resume, he's the person who's going to be tasked with, like, how to shake up this place. Yeah, how to go after the bureaucracy.
We can't talk about this new war that's in front of us, bureaucracy versus the people, without talking about DOGE, Elon Musk, and Vivek Ramaswamy. If you read his books, he's been talking about this problem for a long time. He's also been made to stand down from the DOGE project, Department of Government Efficiency, after the H-1B visa affair, scandal, Twitter storm. And so I wouldn't mind getting into Vivek, but I guess perhaps we should start on DOGE and Elon Musk, because is this the biggest play? Is DOGE the most important thing about this whole war? Is it where does it fit into tactics and strategy and all of this?
I think it's incredibly important when it comes to the potential for a dramatic change. DOGE, the problem with all of these different commissions and groups of politicians and people who come together to try to save the taxpayer money, or to, go after various expenditures that are enormously wasteful, of which there is so much in government that is enormously wasteful, is that they run up against the challenges of, institutionalized bureaucracy that likes the way things run. There are whole industries that depend on the decisions that we make about food stamps in America and that kind of thing. And then there is also the bureaucrats who want to keep power for themselves, the fiefdoms there that relate to the industry and work hand in hand. And a lot of time those same bureaucrats are planning to go and work for those industries when they leave eventually. And then there's the problem of PR, which is essentially no one is going to read all the waste that you find. The waste book, which has existed in the Senate for quite some time, the late Senator Tom Coburn.
What is the waste book?
The waste, he started it. It's essentially, it was an effort to try to collect and tabulate the amounts of programs, earmarks, and funding that Coburn and his other fellow fiscal conservatives considered to be waste. And it was massive. It's this huge binder. And I don't know if you recall, you may not have been paying attention to politics back then, but the existence of the bridge to nowhere in Alaska became a big deal at the time. It was
what year is this?
This would have been, so this was Ted Stevens. This is a Tea Party era thing. So this would have been 2009, I want to say. Okay. So this is a long time ago. But anyway, the bridge to nowhere was a project meant to replace a ferry that was going to a small Alaskan island.
Ferry to nowhere.
With a bridge that was going to be far, far more expensive than running the ferry. And there were only a handful of people who even used the ferry. So it made no sense. Okay. But it was obviously something that contractors got pushed through as an earmark in order to have the funding to build it. And essentially this project became something that was, because it was such a silly and outrageous thing to do, became a popular symbol of government waste. Paying attention to government waste, though, is typically very boring. It's things like Medicare fraud and things like that have convoluted explanations, and it's very difficult for people to publicize them. Elon Musk can publicize something in a second. Okay, he can take something that's interesting and wasteful and tell millions and millions and millions of people about it in an instant. And so the issue is that basically by putting someone like that in charge of something instead of your average ex-senator or, sort of the bookish accountant types that typically do this type of work, you have a built-in advantage when it comes to making the case that, hey, this is a horrible program over here. We shouldn't be spending any money on it. And I'm going to highlight it for everybody to see.
That's a very good observation, actually, because when I'd thought of Elon Musk, I think of what he did at Twitter, reducing, I think, the staff by down to 20% or something down to a third. But actually, his foghorn, his megaphone, which is actually one of the brilliant things about Trump, in terms of one of his tools that he can use, is he can make very uninteresting things worldwide news.
Who
did that with Greenland?
Who knew about the Delta smelt? But it is one of these things where he having the power to change the conversation around these things is critical. And rather than just have another boring commission that comes out with a report that nobody reads and then Congress just rejects it out of hand, I think what you're going to see with this is, and Elon, I think, understands this, is it's important to get early wins. It's important to come out with things very early on that can be targeted and become examples of, yes, we can really do this. And the president has the power to do it. Congress has the power of the purse strings. They can appropriate money for these things. But when you have situations like you did during COVID, where an extraordinary percentage of people who had been put on the list of those who should not receive government funding, whether for past crimes, fraud, et cetera, ended up getting a ton of COVID money anyway, because they were just trying to push it out the door. That's not a tenable situation. We can't have that as a government. It's not. It's not functional, and it doesn't represent the taxpayer.
So, do you think that Musk, as well as the foghorn that he has, the megaphone, what can we sort of expect from DOGE, practically speaking? Is there any talk about what kind of team they're going to put together? Is Elon actually going to run the thing, or is he going to just be the megaphone, or is he going to bring in some...
I think he's mostly going to be...
I'd expected Vivek was going to do that.
Yes.
But now that he's not, who is?
I think that's still unclear, though. The people that they have been hiring, and I've read some of the profiles of them, include a lot of people who have backgrounds in accounting but are outside of government and that type of thing. One of the big holdups in Washington for all of these types of reforms is, again, the letter of the law versus norms. The idea that the Pentagon can't survive an audit would be unacceptable if you just viewed it in, at arm's length. But in Washington, they just say, oh, of course it can't survive an audit. It's complicated. Yeah. And it's in the interest of a lot of people that it doesn't have audits, because they want to be able to keep making ridiculous things for, an enormous expense. Because you obviously have the old factor of all these disparate people pouring money into Washington, and no one having it in their own self-interest individually to ask the question of, why are we spending money on X? So,
can I ask about Vivek Ramaswamy?
Sure.
I don't know. I wonder if what's happening to him is sort of a precursor to maybe what it's going to look like when there are fallouts. But why is it that he is no longer part of DOGE?
Well, I think it's kind of shocking that it happened so quickly after this H-1B thing blew up in his face. But I think that one of the things that you have with Vivek is a very short history. And there are a lot of people, I think, who either dislike him in the Trump orbit or who viewed him as kind of a grifter or very new to this whole thing. And the idea that he was kind of trying to go too fast, too quickly was definitely there. I personally think that this is an opportunity for him to kind of reset if he truly is going to.
Yeah, but why? Because he's got the megaphone. He's very effective at getting a message out to a lot of people. So if that's one of the things that Trump looks for, as you've already said. He's got it. He seems to be unbelievably competent. If you look at his record, he's actually achieved a hell of a lot very quickly. People might question that, but I look at it and go like, wow, that's, he's a young man and he's achieved a lot. And the H-1B visa scandal, as far as it's a scandal, I understand how it sort of split the tech right from the MAGA right. Bannon's come out and said that Elon Musk is pure evil. Was the exact phrase. Truly evil guy, I think was the exact phrase he used. But Elon's still there. It hasn't blown up in Elon's face. Maybe he's just too powerful. And maybe it's as simple as that. But so what? They've got different opinions on this one thing, which actually is not even relevant to the DOGE thing. I don't even see what the link is.
I actually think that the problem there is you're thinking about this in policy terms, and I think it was more about what he was saying in those tweets, pissing off Americans. What I would just advise you is that.
Okay, so what did he say in those tweets?
When he was talking about how, okay, did you read the whole thread?
But for listeners who,
I would encourage people to go back and read his whole thread because I don't want to mischaracterize it. But there were a lot of people who felt that what he was essentially saying with this series of tweets was depicting, and I don't want to say this in a racial way, kind of a Asian tiger mom, Indian, whatever, what have you, depiction of what your priorities ought to be as a student. He talks about nerds and jocks, and he talks about how, you need to be more focused on all of these different things in your life that are about, technology and the pursuit of this, this type of, education first kind of agenda, that we have too many sleepovers, that we have too much socialization as a priority when it comes to kids and raising them, that we have, that our focus should instead be on this kind of tech bro, for lack of a better term, hierarchy of achievement. That is profoundly at odds with what most Americans and conservatives desire for themselves and for their families. When my wife and Laura Loomer and Ann Coulter are all mad at you at the same time, that means that you stepped in it. Okay. And so what I'm saying is that view is inherently at odds with the experience of Americans with kids, especially post-COVID, where the big problem is not enough socialization. The big problem is that kids spent 2 years looking at screens. The big problem is that they didn't have the opportunity. I mean, he criticizes school sports in that. School sports, I think, is one of the most important things that comes out of the youthful experience. You learn as much from that as you do in a classroom, and especially about other humans and about how to relate to them. And the fact that you just want to sort of toss all that aside and say, nope, you should just focus on learning the code. That's the way that came across. And I think that stuck in people's craws way more than the H-1B thing, because it sounds so tone deaf to
the American experience,
what the American experience has been and what people view as our current challenges. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind, one of my favorite sociologists who's working today is named Ryan Burge, and I hope that you talk to him at some point. He is a professor who focuses on researching American religion. You can find his Substack at Graphs About Religion, and it's really fascinating stuff. One of the things that he tracks is, of course, the downfall, the decline of faith in America, the decline of faith in religious institutions. But one thing that's really interesting, and he comes back to it pretty frequently, is that culturally, religion and religious community is still held as hugely important even by Americans, and particularly traditionalist, not just conservative, but traditionalist Americans, whether Republican or Democrat, even if they aren't participating in it themselves, which is fascinating. It's like people know this is a good thing. I wish we had more of it in our culture and in our life. I wish we had more people who were meeting at church instead of on apps. I think that that's a very positive thing. It gives me hope for the future that we can rediscover that. Because I think it's essential to the survival of not just the American Republic, but to the West. But I also think that when you start saying those things about achievement that sound like they're built in a Silicon Valley lab, people just recoil from it. Most people just don't like that. And they would vastly prefer, to hear the kind of things that come out of someone like J.D. Vance, where he appreciates, I think, both sides of that.
Okay, so we sort of covered a great deal of the Vivek and we touched on RFK. I suppose if we're going to talk about the Avengers, J.D. Vance, vice president, he seems like a pretty obviously key Avenger.
Yeah, I mean,
how does he fit into this?
I think this is going to be really fascinating because you have a combination of a vice president who has very strongly held opinions about policy in the world. Clearly, he's been writing about these issues for, more than a decade, has his own opinions, came around relatively late to Donald Trump. In fact, he was criticizing Trump even after he first got elected, which is not true of, a lot of the people who, are able to navigate their way into Trump's orbit. But I think that in Vance, you have someone who is also a young, ambitious guy who wants very much for this administration to be a success so that he can use it as a jumping off point for his own run for the presidency, which everyone anticipates he'll be making in 4 years. Vance, I think, is critical in a role of not just defending what the president does, which he's shown himself so capable of doing over the past several months, but he's also, I think, critical because a lot of the different hirings and policy direction on this for this administration are going to be areas that he has deep sentiments about, whether it's child tax credits, whether it's boosting family formation, helping out the working class in America, trade policy, his attitude towards China and tariffs. And he's also, of course, very close to people in Silicon Valley, given his background. And he's someone who I think has strong opinions about AI and about, different areas of America's advancement that are atypical for a vice president to have. Certainly, you could not imagine someone with less in common with the prior vice president.
But what's his role in the battle against bureaucracy?
I think JD is very well aware of the challenge that bureaucracy represents to all of those, that basically we have an entrenched system that has to be dramatically changed, not just by putting someone different in charge of it, but by rooting out a lot of the different elements that have held on there for far too long. And Vance understands that, I think, to a greater degree and is willing to push the envelope to a greater degree, certainly than someone like Mike Pence, who comes from the old guard, polite Republican conservative establishment. He is a conservative, but the conservative establishment that really doesn't like impoliteness or ruffling feathers. JD is the opposite of that. He is a fighter, and the hillbilly in him comes out when he gets into the real scrap. And I think that proved to be very much to his advantage. He's an incredibly intelligent guy. And so I think that it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, what he prioritizes as vice president, and how effective he's going to be in pushing these various aspects of the agenda that I think he understands are critical to Trump's success.
So, Ben, tying this all together then, the sort of Avengers versus the bureaucrats, how do we tie a bow on this conversation? What have I missed? What are the other key aspects of this battle that presumably we're going to be all watching keenly for the next 4 years?
I think the element of this that you've missed, if there is one, is how Republicans on Capitol Hill respond to all of this. As you know, there's a very slim margin in the House, and Donald Trump plucked a ton of people from the House to go into his administration. And you have new senators, people who are going to be there for the first time, who are going to change the body in different ways, including, of course, replacements for Marco Rubio and for J.D. Vance. And that's, I think, going to lead to a Capitol Hill environment that's far more Trumpian than it has been at any point. Meaning, when he was first elected, it was a surprise. You had Paul Ryan, leading the House, very different priorities than Donald Trump. You had Mitch McConnell as leader in the Senate, very different priorities, including open animosity from Trump. And that's something that really impacted the way that the agenda played out on Capitol Hill. This time around, you don't have any of those problems. You have a united front, really, when it comes to these policies, especially from the members who made the difference in winning the House, which are red districts in blue states, meaning districts in California and New York. And those are people who essentially came into our politics after Trump arrived. You also have a whole set of new Democrats who've been elected post-16, who haven't been around for a very long time, who don't have any of that animosity that came out of the Women's March and things like that back in 16 and 17 that didn't allow them the possibility of working with Trump. We've already seen that from John Fetterman, going down to Mar-a-Lago, and Trump, I think, speaking very highly of him, not just because he respects him politically, but because he views Fetterman as being a Democrat he can work with. And I do think that that is legitimately going to change a number of the ways that these policy debates play out. Before, you had someone like Joe Manchin, who was always kind of an independent streak guy, wasn't necessarily representative of the Democratic coalition, and left, after becoming an independent in the very end of his tenure, as well as Kyrsten Sinema. Now, I think you have a set of Democrats who feel like they can cross over to vote for things like the Laken Riley bill, that they can be with the president on immigration issues to a greater degree. You wouldn't see anything like that going back to 2017, 2018. What does that all mean? Well, I think it means that conservatives, traditional conservatives, free marketers, people who resemble basically the policies of the pre-Trump era, who are still very much around in Washington and on Capitol Hill, they are going to have points of contention with this. We've already seen that in, the president's animosity towards someone like House member Chip Roy from Texas, who's a strong fiscal conservative, getting into it a little bit with Thomas Massie and the like. The hardcore fiscal conservatives, I think, they're not going to like certain aspects of Trump's agenda because he's going to be someone who is far more open to government spending than they would like him to be, and who wants to use that spending power in different ways. What I do think is going to end up, though, is he's going to be able to get a lot more done this time around than he ever was the last time around. The Russiagate investigation, the animosity of Democrats, including Democrats who naturally should have been on his side, meaning in critical or swing states, that prevented him from being able to advance an agenda beyond a lot of things that, essentially he got his tax cuts, and then a lot of it was executive orders and judicial nominations. This time around, I think you are going to see a dramatic number of steps taken within these first 2 years on not just taxes, but on energy, on education, potentially. I think you're going to see another crack at healthcare that comes late, perhaps after the midterms. And I think that you're going to see him really feel like he's got a lot more latitude to achieve things, given how much he's got a unified party behind him. I was saying the other day, reminds me of the litany from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the Dweebos, the Motorheads, they all think he's a righteous dude. and so that to me is something that potentially will lead to a far more successful administration, but you still have to execute it. You still have to make it happen. And priorities, I think, are going to be key in a moment when you can go through the list. You've got Syria falling. You have, ISIS reborn. You have Iran shaking its fist. You have the frustrations surrounding the continuing war in Ukraine and Russia. You have a Europe that doesn't really know what they're doing. Canada's about to have a new leader. There's a new president in Mexico who's going to, he got along with AMLO. He's not going to get along with Sheinbaum, I don't think. And I think that you have a recognition with statements like he's made about the Panama Canal and with Greenland, that this is going to be an administration, when it comes to foreign policy and national security, very mindful of the security of the Western Hemisphere and protecting that as a first priority, unentangling a lot of the different relationships that we've had overseas that he believes we've gotten a raw deal from, demanding our allies step up more in a lot of different areas. And how that plays out, you have to go through all those things before you even get to domestic policy. So there's a lot of things that he's going to have to be dealing with from day one.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, Ben Domenech, thank you so much for speaking with me and unpacking the Avengers versus the bureaucracy, one which I will be keenly watching, and I'm sure you will as well. And maybe we should have a catch-up, an appraisal down the line.
I'd love to do that.
How it goes. But thank you. And where can listeners and viewers find you?
Sure. You can find my Substack at The Transom, thetransom.com. I'm editor-at-large of The Spectator World, which you can find at thespectator.com. I hope folks will subscribe to both. And then I have my own podcast with Fox, the Ben Domenech podcast. Such an inventive name.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time, and we'll do it again. Thanks for watching The Winston Marshall Show. That was Ben Domenech. If you want to hear more phenomenal guests like Ben discussing the issues you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch, well, then press subscribe. And you can also head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, our Substack channel, where you get exclusive videos, content, and an exclusive extended conversation between me and Ben discussing not only the grooming gangs, but also trans ideology in America and how it swayed the American election. But until next time, be well.